I was born in New York. My great-grandmother was born about a mile from here. But after the war, during an 11-year Yankee occupation, my great-great-great-grandfather, who was the rabbi of the Orthodox synagogue here, well, they couldn't pay him. And he opened a hoop skirt factory and just was a clergyman on the weekends. But the occupation became very oppressive. And imagine if you have foreign troops wandering around with guns everywhere. And finally he decided in 1873 to take the family to Baltimore. And there he could function as a rabbi, and the war hadn't touched Baltimore. And he could support his family. So then his granddaughter, my great-grandmother, met a New Yorker who was visiting Baltimore. They fell in love, and he took her to New York. So my grandmother, my mother and I were all born in Manhattan, but my great-grandmother was born here in Charleston, and I always knew that I was really a Charlestonian in exile, and came back here as soon as I could. I first visited in 1980 and took one look at it and knew that I would live here one day. And I rented homes here for years, and then finally bought this in 2010, and now I'm a permanent resident. And I say what the Charleston lady said when they asked her, "Have you traveled?" And she said, "Why should I? I'm already here." So I feel very much at home here. And the houses of my ancestors are all around town. And to walk from one to the other and then to the cemetery and see where they're all buried, it's quite an experience.
So your family line here goes back quite a ways, that's correct?
Yes. The direct line to 1830. And then the collateral lines to the 1730s. And there are the Lazaruses and the Moises and various families like that came here in the very early 18th century. The first Jews recorded here were in 1695. And we built this magnificent synagogue on Hazel Street, Holy Congregation House of God, KKBE. And it's really the finest Greek revival building in the city. And that was the foundation of the religion here. I think that there's been a synagogue on that spot since 1749. And the one that's there now was built when the old temple burned, and this was opened in 1840.
I remember reading that at the time of the Civil War that the highest Jewish population was in South Carolina or in Charleston. Is that correct?
No, in 1800.
No. Okay, in 18. Okay.
The largest Jewish population in the country was here.
Okay.
And
before that.
That's not that many people. It's about 500. And then there were new immigrations. The earliest Jews here were Sephardic, meaning Spanish and Portuguese. And they arrived in 1695 and created the temple. And it was very traditional, modeled on Spanish and Portuguese synagogues in England. And then a wave of Germans came in the 1840s and overwhelmed the original Spanish and Portuguese Jews by numbers. And immigration continued, and then of course from 1880 to 1924, 2 million Jews came to America. In 1880 there were just 250,000 of us, and most Jews who live in America now their ancestors came between 1880 and 1924. But we were here since the beginning. This colony was founded in 1670, and Jews got here, 25 years later. So there's a long Jewish tradition in Charleston.
So, you know, what was really interesting when I first found out about you through Don Livingston's, or Abbeville Institute, was that I feel like a lot of what you were talking about when you were talking about the South, it kind of shattered a lot of stereotypes that I see, like in the media nowadays. Like the idea that a Jewish person would be you're wearing a battle flag, aren't you, right now? The fact that you're wearing a battle flag, I think to a lot of people my age and younger, they would not, their binary thinking, they wouldn't be able to wrap their heads around it.
Well, then they better look at history, because, of course, the closest advisor to President Jefferson Davis was Judah P. Benjamin. He was first Attorney General of the Confederacy, then Secretary of War, and then Secretary of State, and the head of its spy network. He was the closest advisor to Jefferson Davis and his closest friend, and sometimes I think they were the only two men who really believed in the Confederate nation, because most people, most soldiers certainly, were not fighting for the Confederacy, they were fighting for their states. And if you go and look at most Confederate monuments, the one out at Magnolia Cemetery, these died for their state. You look at Union monuments, these died for the Union. So, and Jefferson Davis said that if the Confederacy fell, put on its tombstone, killed by a theory, states' rights. So the irony of it was, in order to defeat the overreach of Washington, and we seceded because the government in Washington was reaching into areas that had no business, and I might say so, it's happening today too. The states seceded one by one against strong centralized federal power. But the irony of the Confederacy was, in order to defeat the thing they hated, they had to become it, at least temporarily. Jefferson Davis did things that made him a very hated man by the end of the war. He confiscated firearms. Now, you know what's going on now with this Second Amendment business, NRA and all, because the Army needed them. He confiscated copper, but that's how you made whiskey. In a still, you needed copper, because the Army needed it and the Yankees had taken over the copper mines. He confiscated grain that was being used to make hooch, rather legal and illegal whiskey, so people, because the Army needed the grain to eat. He suspended habeas corpus. You could hold a man indefinitely in jail. Lincoln did the same, but so did Jefferson Davis. The Confederacy was at war from its birth to its death, and it had to be on a war footing with a strong central government. And the reason they seceded was to get away from that kind of government. So that's the remarkable irony. So at the end of the war, Robert E. Lee was viewed as a saint, but Jefferson Davis was a hated man, and so was Judah Benjamin, his buddy. Judah Benjamin escaped England. He knew that they were trying to hang the assassination of Lincoln on him because he was the spy master. And Jefferson Davis was captured. He was thrown into prison under horrible conditions for 2 years and more, broke his health, which was very delicate to begin with. And when he came out, the South had completely changed toward him. Now he was a Christ figure. Pius IX, the Pope, sent him a crown of thorns as a symbol of his suffering. Now he was the one who had suffered for his people and been manacled and chained and abused for 2 years, and they loved him. He never became a national hero, as Robert E. Lee did, but he became a regional
Southern hero.
And those 2 years of suffering completely created this great reputation, and now we understand what he went through to try to create a Confederate nation. He built a nation, and he also brought industrialization to that nation. They had to be able to make uniforms, and that's metal and leather and cloth and all that, and they did not have that capacity until the war forced them. Even the cotton, we grew the cotton, but it had to be processed in the north. So it was no good to us once we, of course, the blockade of the ports kept us from getting the cotton off those wharfs anyway. But it's quite a drama that the true story of Jefferson Davis and the Southern people, a love, kind of first hate, then love, first love, then hate, then love relationship. Very, very interesting.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned Robert E. Lee as having been a national hero. So now I kind of want to talk to you about this whole memory thing.
Right.
How have we gone from just a knowledge or an acceptance from all of Americans that this man, Robert E. Lee, is a hero, a national hero, to being a traitor, to being a villain, to being someone whose statue should be not displayed for anyone to see, who should be erased from the minds of young people?
Right. America has stumbled into something called identity politics, which can destroy our country by separating our people one from the other. Political correctness is another name for it. Everything is seen through the narrow lens of race, class, gender. Everything. Which means that the heroes who gave us our country, George Washington, the father of our country, who built this country, created it out of nothing. Thomas Jefferson, who took the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness out of the books of Mr. Locke, the philosopher whose bust is right next to you, and made a country out of it. When he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he transferred the ideas of John Locke into the charter of a nation. This is one of the great men of history. If you made a dozen great men, I think Jefferson would be among them. And then Madison, who wrote the Constitution, essentially, and then added the Bill of Rights. These are geniuses and extraordinary human beings. But now, since they all own slaves, they're villains. But in those days, and of course racists, but how in the world can we as intelligent people expect George Washington to ever have an inkling that black and white people could live together on the same social level? It would never occur to him. The black people were slaves, a completely different class of people. Was he wrong from our point of view? Of course. That we interact now, black and white. We're beginning, I hope, to have more and more of, I had hoped, more and more of a colorblind society. We elected a black man president. We have changed everything because we've made the mistake of judging people from the 18th and 19th century by the standards of the 21st century. There's been an enormous racial breakthrough in 1960, the great civil rights movement. Before that, I would say almost every white American in the country was a racist from the point of view of that we have today.
From our standpoint.
Yes. But we learned something. If you sit next to a black person in a bus, or drink from a fountain, the same fountain, or sit next to them in the theater, the world isn't going to end. Nothing's going to change except you'll be treating your fellow human being decently, which we weren't before. We're guilty of a daily psychological aggression against 10% of our population. And the civil rights movement fought that and gave black people the vote in places like Mississippi. And now in Mississippi, there are a tremendous number of black office holders. In my youth, before 1960, and even in the 60s, a white man could kill a black man in Mississippi, nobody would care. So everything has changed for the better, except something has happened to make us go off in this tangent. We demand perfection of our ancestors. This is known as the perfect conquering the good. These were all good men. They were not perfect from our point of view. But rather than look at the fact that we're not perfect either, we see them as villainous. And if Washington and Jefferson and Madison, who created this country, are villains, then our country is villainous and evil. And I think that that may be behind this whole thing. A desire to tear down America in the eyes of its citizens. What a catastrophe it would be if this great nation, which Ronald Reagan called the last hope of Earth, which defeated the Nazis and defeated the fascists and defeated the Soviets, now goes on to devour itself in a kind of cannibalism in which we tear down our great men and the great ideas they fostered, and we go back to tribalism, in which it's been suggested by a black Congress person recently. She's attacked the Black Caucus because the Black Caucus represents, these are congressmen who represent their constituents who aren't all black. And she said, no, they should be representing black interests and not the interests of anyone else. This is suicide of our republic, that black people in Congress represent black people, and Jewish people in Congress represent Jewish people, and Catholics represent Catholics. This is what people were afraid of when Kennedy was elected. He was only going to represent Catholic, which was not a nonsensical fear, because of course he did not. He represented everybody. But now it's happening, that you have race dominating every conversation. And if you have, as we have now, this clack in the Congress of 4 women of color, no matter how outrageous what they say is, if you dare to oppose them, they play the race card. In their deck, every card is the race card.
Yeah,
You can't oppose anything I say because I'm a woman of color.
it's like a magic wand or something.
It's madness. Now, President Trump's overreaction and his childish suggestion that people who were born in America should go back where they came from is chilling and totally inappropriate. He is not helping the situation, he's exploiting it. So now we have people on the extreme right and left who seem to care very little about the country, but only about their particular constituency. Trump has his, and he plays to them, and these Congress people have theirs, and they play to them, and the whole country fractures. So I never thought I would see this. It's a very dangerous period. But race, class, and gender become, both for the Congress people and for Trump, they're playing that card all the time, and attacking, assuming that many Americans feel that way. And I hope that's not the case, that people of sense will see that both sides are very much at fault here, and we have to tone down the rhetoric and think of the country. But taking, so it's not just Robert E. Lee, it's the founders of our country.
Well, they kind of didn't they kind of view the Confederate ones as low-hanging fruit, and then they want to go on.
Exactly. But they've now, Thomas Jefferson's statue has been shrouded in a tarpaulin in the middle of the lawn of the University of Virginia, which he founded. This is incredible, because he had slaves and saw things radically differently from the way we do, and we're punishing him for not thinking the way we do. You know, if a slave ran away, to Ohio, he would be expelled. They didn't want free blacks there. The North had laws against it. Everybody was racist. It's shocking. We read these documents now, and it's shocking the way people thought. But that's the way they thought. And how in the world can we expect them to think the way we do?
There might be people like down the line who will look back at us and be like, why do these people think this way? Why did they tear down this statue?
If the vegetarians take over the world, and they might, for a variety of good reasons, they will look back at us and say, these were horrible people. Millions of animals were killed every year, maybe every week, so they could eat steaks that weren't even good for them. But they didn't care about the suffering of the animal. Yet they went to church and they said they were good people, but they weren't. They were monsters. So we can easily be seen by the future vegetarian rulers of America as equally as evil as slave owning. Robert E. Lee, in my opinion, was the greatest American of the 19th century, and the real story of Lee and slavery is very interesting. He never bought a slave. He didn't believe in slavery. He inherited 186 slaves from his father-in-law, together with Arlington Plantation, with the orders in the will to free them in 5 years. So Lee took a leave of absence from the United States Army. He had, after all, he was superintendent at West Point. He was a very important man in the Union Army. And he went home to Arlington, and he tried to get the place together. It was economically falling apart. The big house which is a magnificent house, was falling apart. His father-in-law had been a very careless steward of his property. So Lee started 2 schools at Arlington Plantation and another one that he owned. It was forbidden in Virginia to teach blacks to read or write, but he started 2 schools for black slaves to enable them to read and write and do numbers, so that when he freed them within those 5 years, they would be capable of dealing with the world. That's the kind of man he was. And in doing so, he was violating the laws of Virginia, which must have been terrible for him, because he believed in order and law. But he did it because he cared for them and didn't want them loosed on the world, incapable of dealing with the world. So he had the schools. White House Plantation was the other one. He owned both. And then, in 1862, in the middle of the war, he asked his wife for a list of every slave by name. And he tried, as he freed them in that year, he tried to get jobs for them. He wrote to his wife, "What about Jimmy? Do you think we can get a job for him on the railroad?" Now, with the prestige of the Lee name, if Lee if Lee wrote to the head of the railroad, "I'd like you to take Jimmy on in some capacity," Jimmy would get the job. So that's what in the middle of the war, he took time to provide for these people. He didn't believe in slavery. He didn't think secession was a good idea. He thought we had the right to it under the 10th Amendment. The states, remember, pre-existed the Union. 13 independent states. And then they created the Union through the Constitution, and 2 of those who signed said, "We reserve the right to withdraw from this Union." The Union is the creation of the states. It's like a club. You join a club, and then you say 10 years later, "I want to resign." "Oh, no, you can't. You joined." The Union was not like that. Most people assumed that the 10th Amendment gave the states the right to secede. And the 10th Amendment says those powers not specifically given to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people. That would include the right to withdraw, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say secession is forbidden. So Robert E. Lee saw that we had the right to do it, but he thought it would be unwise. And he might have been right, because the war was unwinnable against the mighty Union. We couldn't win. The only reason it lasted 4 years was we had General Lee and Stonewall Jackson, 2 military geniuses. And when Jackson was killed, things began to go downhill. We could have won at Gettysburg if Jackson had been there with Lee, but he wasn't. So we had the right to secede. Lee believed that, but he also said, "I advise against it." And then Lincoln offered him, as the states seceded, not Virginia yet, Lincoln offered him command of the Union troops, and he said, "I can't lead an army against my own people." So he resigned from the army, and he said, "I will just become a farmer now. I'll go back to Arlington." And then Virginia seceded. And Lee's great hero was George Washington. And when he was called to command the armies of Virginia, he went to the Capitol in Richmond, and there, where he waited in the rotunda to go in and accept the commission, there's the great statue of George Washington. And he said, it broke my heart, because all his work is falling apart. But he said, "I fought because Virginia is my country, and Virginia chose to secede, and their decision was incumbent upon me. It had nothing to do with slavery or even the issue of secession. I was bound to follow the decisions of the elected government of Virginia." And before the war between the states, there was an argument of men of probity and intelligence and our political leaders. Where is your first loyalty? Is it to the state or to the Union? It was an open question, and intelligent and sincere men debated it. Now, those who chose the state were not betraying the Union any more than those who chose the Union were betraying the state. People went either way. In the South, most people chose the state. Now, interestingly enough, I have taught here in the College of Charleston and at Montclair State University in New Jersey. And I asked the students questions just to see where their heads are. And I said, the College of Charleston, I said, gentlemen, would you give your life for the United States of America? Of course, if there's a war, we'd sign up. Would you give your life for South Carolina? A remarkable number nodded their heads. And then I asked the same question in Montclair, New Jersey. Gentlemen, would you give your life for your country in time of war? Yes. Would you give your life for New Jersey? They all burst out into laughter. Of course not. New Jersey, north and west and east are directions. The South is a place. And New Jersey does not function in the mind of anyone in New Jersey the way South Carolina does among the people down here. And that loyalty to the state is still very real. We fought a war over this issue. And so it's very moving to see that local government is the most efficient thing. After this war between the states, America changed. The government kept amassing power. We engaged in foreign adventures that were oppressive to other people. And the Southern influence for limiting government, well, we lost the war, and there's a penalty for that. But it's regrettable. The attitude now is, well, look what's happened to General Custer. General Custer was one of the great heroes. Now he's one of the great villains.
They all are, aren't they? I mean,
Well, they can't do that. They're trying to do it to Robert E. Lee. The vast majority of people in this city know the greatness of Lee, and they honor their own ancestors. To honor the Confederate flag, for me, is to honor a young man named Perry Moses, who was a pious Jew and a Southern hero. At the Battle of Malvern Hill, he was 18 years old, and he charged up that hill. And that day, the flag, the battle flag, changed hands 6 times. Because if you took the flag, you were the target of every Yankee gun. And yet these boys, with incredible courage, vied with each other for the honor of carrying the colors. They knew it would happen. So one boy has it that would come out of the woods going up that hill to the Yankee line, and I've stood there as if I can see them there. And they're yelling the rebel yell, and the boy with the flag is immediately shot. Another one picks it up. He's shot. Another one picks it up. And Perry picked it up at the end. He actually got to the Yankee position, was shot in the heart, and fell on the flag. The flag to us means honoring dead heroes. Unfortunately, it is true that a symbol, by definition, has a variety of meanings. And to other people of thoughtfulness and intelligence, black people and others, the flag means racism. Now, when did that happen? It's a long process.